displayed up here, I think in the third video. And Cal Borchers, who is a Northeastern graduate, and despite his remarkable youth, has worked for the Boston Globe, the Washington Post as a political reporter, and just moved back to Boston, where his wife got a job offer she couldn't refuse, and he's now working for WBUR, covering business, but also working for their national shows. And so the two of them together have a tremendous amount of experience, and I think thoughts to share with us about what it's like covering Washington these days, and what to look forward to with the midterms, or not look forward to, depending on how things turn out. Tim Ransmark is back and will be joining us as well. Just a preview for next week. Next week, we're going to be looking at climate change, going from the tsunami of election news to real tsunamis. And we've got a great panel there of a number of science journalists and environmental reporters who will talk about some of the challenges of not only covering climate change, but getting readers to read and watch shows about climate change, which is something I think that is becoming an increasing challenge in terms of how the media can engage not just policymakers, but ordinary citizens on this issue. So as usual, we're going to start with a few videos, and then I'll introduce our panel.
The way you would cover a president before Donald Trump is you would cover everything the president said. Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, both Bushes. If they said something, you covered it. And they didn't say things every day.
You were dealing with an institution that functioned like an institution. They had messaging, they had officials that tried to stick to that message.
If the president didn't like something, he would say it.
In a more traditional administration, and that is both the White House and other parts of the administration, there's a lot more discipline. So even when people are leaking, they're leaking on behalf of their bosses.
We had a very tense relationship with the Obama administration. I never met President Obama the whole time I ran anything. I was just coming to because I wanted to have a standoffish relationship with him. If there was a controversy, they called and complained. Sometimes they complained publicly.
And that's just not the case in the Trump White House.
The new normal, if you will, is that we have a president who really wants to undermine us. We have a president who attacks us in very vicious terms.
There are parts of it that try and function like an institution, but at the very top, we've seen time and again that he kind of makes his own decisions.
We're not used to presidents being so public in their distaste for the press. We're not used to presidents being so much on the attack and trying to undermine the credibility of the press. I don't mind the President of the United States criticizing us, but I think this president has gone farther than any others, and I think dangerously so.
So to all Americans, in every city near and far, small and large, from mountain to mountain, from ocean to ocean,
I thought in that moment that he had given a speech that was unlike any inaugural speech I'd heard.
Hear these words: you will never be ignored again.
I think it hit me in that moment that this was going to be a different presidency, and it was going to be an amazing story. It has turned out to be an unbelievable story.
It just became clear to me after he won that he needed a punching bag, and after Hillary had been defeated, the press was going to be this new punching bag.
One of the challenges for us is to cover him not only as the President of the United States, but as a president who publicly says things are false, and a president who also is still in business.
Keeping up is incredibly difficult. I feel endless sympathy for our readers.
This is a president who tweets several times in a day.
And there are often so many new characters kind of coming in and out, and new names that it's hard to keep up with. Wake up Saturday morning and you see the president's tweeting about fake news and interviewing people. And my first thought is, thank God I'm not one of the White House reporters, because their Saturday just got ruined. And then my second thought is, at some point, how you disengage from all this. It is incredibly difficult.
It's a little bit of a struggle to figure out how to cover a president when he says something and the lag time between his saying it and you being able to prove that it's false.
We've fallen into a pace that is a bit more manageable for everyone. There are still incredibly busy moments. I think the challenge now for a lot of journalists is to step back. Just every day there's some little tidbit of news. You can grab it and you'll get a story out of it and people will read it. But to really step back and kind of provide some context for readers, I think that's a real struggle now.
We do fact checks constantly now because he says things that are factually challenged, if you will. We've used phrases that I would never have imagined using in a newspaper. I mean, we used the word lie during the campaign. The simple fact that people around the president were willing to talk to Russia and accept dirt about Hillary Clinton is pretty remarkable.
The Trump White House, especially in its early days, was like a lot of guys trying to kind of win favor with the boss, putting knife in each other's backs. And so, you know, you would get a lot of people at the very top, in the middle, at the bottom, all very willingly go on the reservation to talk to me or many of my colleagues who actually cover the White House about a range of issues.
It's not just about the New York Times. It's not just about Trump. It's about an institution, the press, in our democracy, the essential role that it plays.
I mean, our view is we should cover him the way we've covered presidents before. We have to cover him aggressively and in a questioning way.
If we're fighting for anything, it's fighting for kind of a space in the middle where reasonable people disagree, where there's a central set of shared facts and shared ideas around which people discuss kind of the bigger policies and issues of the day. That space you've seen in the last year and a half has gotten smaller and smaller.
I don't mind if Donald Trump says, I don't like the New York Times' coverage. I don't mind if he criticizes stories. I do mind if he calls the press the enemies.
They are the enemy of the people.
Trump got me.
Okay, this next clip is from Donald Trump's 60-minute interview, which just ran this past Sunday, where he's being interviewed by Leslie Stahl. And here are a couple of excerpts.
Treated me much differently on the subject.
I disagree, but I don't want to have that fight with you.
It's okay.
Another fight with you.
Listen, it's okay. The one time I'm president and you're not. I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. You know, we're talking about all
That's
billions of
denying.
years. You'd have to show me the scientists because they have a very big political agenda. There's something really terrible and disgusting about that if that were the case. So we're going to have to see. We're going to get to the bottom of it, and there will be severe punishment. He doesn't want to go to war, and we don't want to go to war. And he understands the nuclearization, and he's agreed to it. And you see that he's agreed to it.
Do you trust him?
I do trust him. Yeah, I trust him. That doesn't mean I can't be proven.
Why would you trust him?
Well, they meddle, but I think China meddled too. And
Why
I
do you
think
say
other
China
countries-
meddled?
You want to know something?
Why do you say China? Why don't you just
Let me
say
ask
the
you.
Russians meddled?
Because I think China meddled also.
How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it?
Makes sense.
I didn't really make fun.
Well, they were laughing. Do you think you treated her with a great
Say
respect?
this again. I didn't.
But you seem to be saying that she lied.
Well, you know what? I'm not going to get into it because we won. It doesn't matter. We won. It could be that he is. I think he's sort of a Democrat, if you want to know the truth. But General Mattis is a good guy. We get along very well. He may leave. I mean, at some point, everybody leaves.
Are you willing to reinstitute that policy that you said we're looking at everything? Yes
You can't say yes. What I can say is this. There are consequences from coming into a country, namely our country, illegally.
Will you pledge that you will not shut down the Mueller investigation?
Well, I don't pledge anything, but I will tell you, I have no intention of doing that. I think it's a very unfair investigation because there was no collusion of any kind.
It gives you a feel for what it's like, the challenges of interviewing the president. And so now this is entering the Wayback Machine, looking at a piece that Dan Lothian, who will be one of our panelists today, did about Barack Obama and dealing with something which has become a huge issue for the Democrats, which is attracting blue-collar voters. Obviously, the white working class has become the short version of attracting disaffected whites who maybe have left the Democratic Party and feel they're not being listened to. And this is a huge part of Trump's victory in 2016, as we now know, and also is something that the Republicans are relying on for the midterms in a few weeks. So this is back from, when is this from,
2012.
2012?
It's a more retail-style approach, but unlike the president's other official bus trips last year, this one has campaign written all over it. There's a big presidential seal on the door, and the venue in the small city of Maumee, Ohio, has been carefully staged. White picket fences, a large American flag, and a soft story about his daughter.
It was Malia's birthday yesterday. See, when she was small, I could say all these fireworks I had arranged for her birthday. But she doesn't believe me anymore.
But his speech turned tough when the president took on his opponent's business experience.
Governor Romney's experience has been in owning companies that were called pioneers of outsourcing. That's not my phrase. Pioneers of outsourcing.
It's a message that resonates with this crowd. Unemployment in Ohio is below the national average of 8.2%, but the people in this city have experienced the highs and lows of the manufacturing industry. From GM and Chrysler on life support to a recovery and new investments in the region that the president said were possible because of his administration's auto bailout.
Governor Romney said we should just let Detroit go bankrupt. I refuse to turn my back on communities like this.
And as if on cue, although the campaign denies political motivation, the administration is filing a complaint with the World Trade Organization against China for alleged unfair tariffs on some American-made autos.
But we're going to make sure that competition is fair. That's what I believe.
While the president was making that case and defending his economic policies, not far away, Romney's surrogates were knocking down what Mr. Obama was playing up. Former presidential candidate Tim Pawlenty and Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal are on their own bus tours shadowing the president.
His presidency has been a losing hand for Ohio and for America. We know that we are not better off than we were 4 years ago.
The president says the Republicans don't have real solutions and that a full recovery will take time. That's the message he took to his second stop at an ice cream social in Sandusky.
It's not enough just to recover and get back to where we were before the crisis. We've still got to address this basic challenge of how do we build a strong middle class and make sure that the next generation has the same opportunities that we did. And that's a long-term project. It's not going to happen overnight.
The president will make a total of 6 scheduled stops in 2 key battleground states. Following a final event in Parma near Cleveland, the president will visit Poland, Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh on Friday. In addition to Romney's surrogates on the ground, we noticed something else in the air this morning. Circling the venue of the president's first stop before he arrived, a small plane towing a large banner that read, Romney 2012. Dan Lothian, CNN, Sandusky, Ohio.
Okay, so with that, I'd like to invite up to join us on the panel, Dan Lothian, Cal Borchers, and Ted Lansman. You can applaud. So Ted Lansman, you know, he's the head of the Dukakis Center and has been overseeing the open classroom. Cal Borchers in the middle. Is a graduate of Northeastern University. He graduated in 2012 and has had what I consider a typical millennial journalism career, which has involved many different jobs with many different skills. He's worked as a video sports producer, as an investigative reporter at the Boston Globe, as a sports business reporter at the Boston Globe. When Marty Barron, the editor of the Globe, went to the Washington Post, he took Cal with him and made him a politics and media reporter in Washington, where Cal's job was basically to sort of look at the intersection of media and politics. And as I think he'll talk about, kind of 3 or 4 times a day, have to do these kind of instant analyses of Trump's tweets, how candidates were performing, really drinking from the fire hose. And as Trump came into office and the attacks on the press increased, his inbox became filled with a lot of negative views. He's now at WBUR. He's moved to Boston, back to Boston. And at BUR, he's covering business, but also nationally. As a regular contributor to Here and Now, and really has a terrific future ahead of him in addition to the great work that he's done. Dan Lothian, who you saw, looks exactly the same as he did
Oh, my God.
in 2012.
I just realized I lost a lot of hair.
So Dan has been, one of the most distinguished reporters working in a number of markets, most notably recently at CNN, where he covered the Obama White House. And we'll talk a little bit about what that was like versus covering Trump. He worked with many people who are still prominent today, people like Jim Acosta, who've come under fire from Trump. He's now on the faculty here at Northeastern, teaching ethics, but also teaching entrepreneurship and sort of the new world that journalists need to navigate. So those of you who are journalism students here, if you want to learn how to make a living, these are two people who can talk a lot about what careers in journalism look like and how they're changing. I do promise also the first pitch is 8:39, so we will end at 8 o'clock or a little before so we can all catch the baseball game. I realize what's important. But I wanted to start out maybe with you, Dan, kind of looking at that clip. And a couple of things struck me. One was Obama won Ohio that year. He did better among white working class whites than many expected, and better than Hillary Clinton would do 4 years later. So I'm wondering if you look back at the 2012 race, what happened in 2016, and what people think may or may not happen in the midterms. What's been the arc there? What did Obama have right that Hillary had wrong, and has Trump figured out a way to kind of scramble things once again?
Right. Well, that's a good question, and I think I've often made the comparison to what got Obama elected the first time around is essentially what got Trump elected as well. Obviously, different sets of people and on different spectrums of the political line, but when you look at the odds against President Obama, then candidate Obama, Hillary Clinton had all of the money behind her, the establishment. It was really her race to take home, and I think she ran it that way. And that's part of the reason why she lost. But what you had at the time was a frustrated country, energized younger base that was willing to go out there and campaign for the president, tap into what we look at now is kind of a regular in campaigns, but at the time was innovative, where they were using social media and all of the technology that was available, and then a president or a candidate who went to every corner that he could go to, while Hillary Clinton was only focusing on a few battleground states. He was going to every corner and talking to some of those people who were very frustrated with what was going on in the country at the time. I remember I was traveling through an airport, I believe it was Atlanta, and I was sitting back to back with a couple of, they were white older women who were having this, from the South, who were having this discussion about never having voted for a black man before. And as I heard them detail why they were voting for him, their overall frustration with what was going on in the country at the time, and I knew at that moment, wow, he's going to win, right? These are people who would never have voted for someone like that, but were so angry and longing for change, whatever that change was, that they would vote for President Obama. And that's really what got Trump elected as well. There were a lot of people who were frustrated that maybe a lot of people in the media were not paying attention to, and we quickly found out just how strong that group of people was to elect the president.
And if you look ahead now in a few weeks with the midterms, who do you think, is the dynamic the same, or is it a different dynamic?
I think it's a slightly different dynamic in that it is less about sort of general frustration, and now it's sort of this polarization. And there's so many other factors, such as the recent Kavanaugh hearings and just the general climate in this country that gives it a much different feel, I think, than we've ever seen before. So it's hard, I think, for me now to put what is happening in the present into some of the buckets that we have seen in campaigns in the past. Certainly, I think at the root of it are some of those same sentiments, but I think this is unlike anything we've ever experienced.
I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the things that Dean McKay and the Times reporters were talking about is how different covering this presidency is. Could you talk, and then I want to ask Cal to talk too, what it was like to cover Obama and then how covering Trump feels different?
Right. And I should point out, I also covered, after 9/11, I covered President Bush for a little bit when I was working at NBC, and then came in the last few weeks of the Bush administration. So I had some contact with President Bush before covering 5 years of the Obama administration. And I think what's different, and again, I have not covered Trump, but I'm still in touch with some of my former colleagues who covered him. And what changed was that there was a certain level of respect while we would be away from the cameras. The politicians tend to say some of the crazy things that maybe you see spill out of the public space now. Rahm Emanuel was a colorful character, as you know, and he was not afraid to pick up the phone or chase you down and tell you things in very colorful ways. But that was something that didn't play out in a tweet or on national television. So there was this push and pull that exists with any administration that you cover. But I think what's different now is that there's this real hostile environment where reporters don't feel safe. And we've never, I don't think that I ever felt that my life was in danger, even though people might scream at you when they say, oh, see, whatever they say as you're going down the street. But it's different now. It's a harsher tone, and I think it makes it much more complicated in doing your job, especially when you have an administration that is a moving target. So before, everybody kind of shades the truth in politics, but you had a handle on what the administration was trying to do based on your conversations with sources within the administration, and I think that's a lot harder to do now. Because the president will say one thing, or even members of the administration will say one thing, and the next day it's whiplash.
Cal, so you went down to Washington in 2015,
right?
And started covering kind of the intersection of politics and the media when Trump came into office. What was that like?
Well, I think that one of the things that I will underscore is what you heard Dean McKay, time that say in that video about using the word lie to describe some of this president's rhetoric. And I think that's a really important point. It was something that was really an uncomfortable development for a lot of reporters. Keep in mind that, most of the time it is hard to get into someone's head to know what their motive is. And so, typically you would see untrue statements that political figures make described as false statements. Maybe it's spin or something like that, but it was something that was less judgmental. You would say, we're going to tell you this isn't true, but we don't know whether the person, like you call it a lie, in other words, you're suggesting intent. You're suggesting the person knows that they are saying something that is not true and is deliberately misleading you. And the trigger for the Times, I think the first time they really used the L word was around the birther conspiracy theory and the judgment. And McKay has talked about this in the past. He felt that there was no possible way that Donald Trump could have truly believed that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. There had been so much evidence already put out there. He released his birth certificate as asked. And the fact that Donald Trump continued to say that Obama was not born in the United States had to be a lie. That he knew it was false, and he continued to say it anyway. And I think that's one of the really big differences. And you've seen it happen a lot. It's not just the Times. You've seen a lot of news outlets in the last year and a half beginning to use the L word to describe things that this president says. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts we've seen.
Can you talk a little bit about your life, what it was like covering this administration or writing about this administration, your own dealings with Trump, your own sense of what the media got right, got wrong, what it started to learn? The most difficult people to work with, actually, so I covered politics and the media, and the hardest folks actually were on the media side, and specifically it was Fox News. They have a public relations shop that is as aggressive as any political campaign, certainly that I've dealt with, as far as dogging you about stories after stories, wanting you
to change things, shade things, complaining about coverage. I found that to be really striking because the overlap between Fox News and the White House is so strong. You know, it's not just in the very literal sense where at times you've seen the president hire, Fox News personalities into his administration, right? Bill Shine, former, I guess he was the co-president for a while of Fox News. He's now the communications director in the White House. John Bolton is the national security advisor, was a Fox News commentator. Heather Nauert was the #4 official at the State Department, their spokeswoman, was the newsreader on Fox and Friends in the morning. It's that, but it's also the way that you see Fox News programming show up in quoted or paraphrased tweets from the president just moments later, when it is obvious that what he is doing is sitting in that White House, watching television, and having his policy notions shaped by what he sees on television. I found that to be really, really striking, and that was part of why at the Post we felt that it was so important to have coverage devoted just to the intersection of media and politics. When they hired me in 2015, I became the third media reporter at the Post. We already had Paul Farhi, who was our longtime sort of hard news reporter, I would say, on the media side. We had Eric Wemble, who was our opinion blogger. And in my time there, they added me, and then they hired Margaret Sullivan, the former ombudsman at the New York Times, to come in as a media columnist. And then just as I was leaving, they hired a fifth media reporter as well. So it just gives you a sense of the.
But you had seen the charming side of Donald Trump, right?
I had, yeah. I told one of your earlier classes about, my first interaction with Donald Trump was in probably 2012 or 13, well before he was a candidate for office, when I was at the Globe and I was writing a profile of a business executive named Scott Butera. He was the CEO of Foxwoods at the time, and they were bidding for one of the casino licenses here in Massachusetts. And Butera had worked for Donald Trump at one of his Atlantic City casinos, and I had interviewed Butera, obviously, but I had also called around other folks who had worked with him and known him over time, including Trump, and didn't actually expect to get a response, but was surprised when he picked up the phone. He gave me the ring and spent some time with me on the phone, really singing the praises of Scott Butera, and it does leave an impression. It's one of those things, one of the ways I think that he ingratiated himself with reporters in his pre-political days. He was generous with his time, and one of the reasons perhaps he's been successful in business too is the way that he sort of pats people's egos and gives them praise. Of course, it is on condition that they do the same for him, but that left an impression.
And what is your impression of how the media has coped with Trump? Do you think they got it right from the get-go? Has it been a learning curve?
It was definitely a learning curve. I think that, I think that partly we largely maybe incorrectly assessed voters' priorities during the campaign. For example, we heard in Dan's piece, we heard Barack Obama on the campaign trail delivering a message that in some ways is similar to what we heard as far as an economic message to what we heard from Donald Trump in 2016, which was speaking to working class voters and saying, you've got all this economic uncertainty in your life, but the difference was who's the culprit, who's the villain, right? So in 2012, when we heard from Barack Obama, he painted, I think effectively, the villain as big businesses, right? And he effectively branded Mitt Romney as a vulture capitalist. That was sort of the catchphrase of that election, even though he was technically in private and not another business reporter. But that was a big part of the message. Whereas in 2016, from Donald Trump, the same message to those voters was changed to say that the culprit, the villain, is immigrants, right? It's those other people, those interlopers, those outsiders coming in, they're taking your jobs. So it wasn't about big business outsourcing your jobs. It was about people, invading your country and taking your jobs away. So it was sort of playing to the same basic anxiety, but pointing the finger at a different group to blame.
Dan, in addition to sort of tapping into this kind of desire for change, what was your sense in your personal interactions with Obama or seeing him run the presidency? What was his vision of the presidency, and how is that different maybe than how Trump envisions the presidency?
Wow, that's a tough question because I'm not really sure how Trump envisions it, other than he wakes up and is president and you're not, you know. But so for President Obama, I think on an intellectual level, he enjoyed being president. He enjoyed the power. He enjoyed, being on the world stage and meeting with these various different leaders and helping to shape the view of the United States, which, remember his early trips to the Middle East, it was all part of his campaign to change the way that the Arab world viewed the United States. And so he really saw himself as being sort of this fresh new face with a new agenda that was going to restore some of the credibility to this country. That's sort of on the broader public face of President Obama. Privately, though, he was someone who, at least in my opinion, that he didn't really enjoy a lot of people around him. I think he was uncomfortable and felt a little handcuffed by the presidency, and really only trusted a handful of people, maybe 2 or 3 that would really have any close understanding of what he was feeling that day, and then there was sort of the next layer out from that. But he was, I think he was most at peace when he was with just, 2 or 3 people and having some intellectual conversation or studying something on his computer. That's, that's kind of the personal Obama, and always on guard whenever he was around reporters, whenever he was around me. I mean, he would, I don't know that I truly ever saw him let his hair down, even on Air Force One, where he would come back and have a conversation and it would be off the record. But even then he was somewhat guarded because he didn't really trust us. And with one exception where it was an off the record conversation about Mitt Romney and he said some pretty racy things and it kind of caught us off guard. Like, wow, usually he's not gonna tell us those kinds of things. As again, I haven't covered President Trump, but from afar, I get a sense that he is, he's on a ride that he himself never expected to be on. And when things are going well, he's kind of, enjoying it. And when things are not going well, he's fighting.
You said that it's hard to judge the midterms because so much of it is about polarization. What role do you think the media has played in it? CNN has become a polarizing force in many ways. How much blame do you think we in the media bear for where we've ended up?
I don't know if you can blame us for where it has ended up, but I think there is blame to be passed around for the way that we're sort of reacting to it. There used to be a time when politicians went crazy that you would cover the crazy, but you wouldn't be part of the crazy. And I think, my former colleague, Jim Acosta, has made an art form out of becoming part of the story. And, some of it, I think it's legitimate as he pushes back on the president. But I think in some cases, not just Jim alone, it's if you get pounded over the head day in, day out, then all of a sudden human instinct is to fight back. And you're seeing that played out day after day. And I don't know, personally, I don't know that that's a good thing. And what happens then, the public, which is quite skeptical and frankly hates reporters, many in the public feel that way. And I think this just adds more fuel to that fire, because when they see reporters, even though a reporter may be pushing back on being pushed around and bullied, people will point to that and say, oh, look at them. This is what they are. They're all on the left and they're just looking to undermine the president. And I think that's unfortunate.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that, though. Right now, there are more Americans living in poverty than before the war on poverty started. There are issues on people having to work multiple jobs to just make ends meet, and gentrification and resilience and sea level rise. And yet, we are as likely to see a story trend about what Melania Trump is wearing than about any of those serious issues. Being inside the Washington bubble, for elected officials is something that's often criticized because it divorces them from presumably the electorate. But we've heard in this class that part of the reason that there was a missense of who would win the last election was that the media itself was living inside of a bubble and trending on subjects that missed the point of what was really going on in the country. So the question I have is, how do you folks break out of that bubble in a way where stories that really matter to people who are voting, like poverty or opioids, start to trend in a way that leads to policy?
Well, I think you have a lot of great stuff in that question, but peeling a part of it out of that, I don't know that it was when that election was being covered that it was that they were, reporters were paying a lot of attention to these sort of side surface stories, and not paying attention to jobs or other critical issues. I think, at least from my vantage point, what it was reporters covering the story based on a formula, right? So you talk to the experts in certain regions and you start reading tea leaves, and you realize that if the sentiment is like this here, then usually it means this. There's a way that political reporters go into battleground states and kind of figure out what's going on right away. And usually they're right. And they look at some of the polling data and they talk to some of the right people who have been doing some groundwork, and you kind of have it figured out.
You told me once you got sick of going to Ohio at a certain point.
Yes, I did. I mean, I'm probably in a state that I've never lived in. I think I've been there more than anywhere else in the United States. I did spend a lot of time there. And the election then boils down to just a handful of states, and so that's where the focus is. So I don't know that it was that they were doing silly, stories, and that's how they missed this. I think they were just following this blueprint that typically is followed when you're covering elections. And I'm not defending it. I'm not saying that's right. I think that the way it should have been covered, you obviously have to pay attention to some of these indicators that historically have been fairly close. But at the same time, you have to talk to people, and I think that's what we missed. It wasn't that we were just, doing silly stories. We just weren't talking to the right people in what is often referred to as flyover country.
Callie, let's put on your press critic hat. How do you respond?
Yeah, a couple of ways. I mean, there's layers to it. I think that in some ways, I think that the critique that the press got 2016 wrong is overblown. And I say that because many of the things that we all wrote, said about Donald Trump's chances to win 2016 were right. I mean, I don't think anybody could reasonably argue that he should have been favored in that race, right? He had never held political office before. He had zero experience. He was running against, however many it was, 16 other Republican candidates with far more experience. And the list of reasons goes on. And when you would ask Republican voters in polls early in the primary season, could you ever see yourself supporting Donald Trump as your party's nominee? Overwhelmingly, they would say no. What happened is people changed their minds. People who said they would not be willing to support Donald Trump ultimately did in the end. And so, to some degree, he deserves credit for changing people's minds, but it doesn't mean that when the press reported at the time, Trump appears to have a ceiling, because there's a certain threshold of Republicans who will just never get behind him. We were at least trying to listen to those people. That's what they were telling us. They ultimately changed their minds. I think the other thing to keep in mind too is you look at the predictive models. Nate Silver is right at 538 is probably the most famous. I think that on election day he had Hillary Clinton with a 74% chance to win, right? And the analogy I always use, we had a big baseball game tonight, right? So and conversely, then if she's a 74% chance to win, then Donald Trump is effectively a 260 batter, right? So if a batter comes up in the baseball game tonight and he's hitting 260, I might say, well, Dan, I don't think he's going to get a hit right now. There's a 74% chance he doesn't get a hit, and I'd be right. But if he does get a hit, it's not that surprising, right?
Bradley Jr.
Yeah, right. because 26% of the time he gets a hit, right? Like 1 out of every 4 times he comes up, it's going to happen. So the point, and perhaps we didn't, as a press corps, do a good enough job of explaining to folks what those kinds of predictive models mean. But the point wasn't that there is zero chance Donald Trump is going to win the race. I mean, some people said that, but I don't think very many did. I think it was true that it was more likely than not that he would lose. But he was the equivalent of a 260 batter, and sometimes the 260 batter gets hit.
What about responding to Ted's question, which is when historians look back, chances are inequality, demographic change, climate change, I mean, there's a whole list of things that will be seen as more important.
Yeah.
And yet somehow those are not the focus of attention. Jill Abramson, who was the editor of the New York Times before Dean McKay, spoke yesterday, and someone asked her, how do we improve political reporting and reporting in general? And she said, stop covering Donald Trump so obsessively. In a way, he's just taken up all the oxygen. But how do you, now that you were in the bubble, now you're out of the bubble, what about this question Ted raises, that I think is something a lot of people think about at 2 in the morning, which is this what we should be reading and watching all the time?
Yeah, I think Abramson is right, and the question is right on the line too. And then you run up against the practical reality of business. And I think that's the big constraining factor for a lot of news outlets. What actually gets eyeballs? What gets clicks? What can I sell ads against? It's been interesting to step out of a commercial newsroom and into public radio for the last few months, and we just finished a big fundraiser for the fall, which we get our goal to raise $1.5 million from listeners over the course of a few days. And part of the pitch that apparently works, at least with our core demo, is to say that we have the luxury of not doing that. We don't have to think about, can we sell ads against this segment? Will we get enough clicks on this? And we can do sort of what are actually offbeat stories, but that we consider to be more substantive and important, because there's a certain audience that appreciates it and is willing to pay for it. But I'm very conscious of the fact that not every newsroom is in that position. In fact, the vast majority are not. So I think that's one reality of it. And then I think the other sort of complicating factor that goes with that too is these sort of, news-ish entities, Facebook probably being the most prominent one, right? And they don't consider themselves to be an actual publisher. They consider themselves to be just a platform that serves content produced by other people. But when you talk about which stories are trending, that's based on an algorithm they dictate. I mean, theoretically, Facebook or Twitter could cause frontline documentaries to trend. Might be sort of artificial, but in other words, they could, if they wanted to, serve that content to people more prominently than they do right now. They don't, and again, the business reasons are sort of obvious, and people don't apparently respond to that in the same way. Facebook wants to keep its users on the site or on the app for as long as possible so they can show them more ads. So it's one of those things like, I think we all understand in theory what the solution is. It's a question of how you stay in business doing it.
Let's put on your political hats, and I wanted to play a game that I was thinking about called Smart or Stupid, which is I'm going to tell you something that's going on in the news, and I want you to tell me briefly whether you think it's smart or stupid. Ken, I'd like you to play along as well. Elizabeth Warren taking a DNA test, smart or stupid?
Where we start?
We'll start with Dan.
Oh, with me? Boy. I guess it's smart. It does. I'm saying smart because the next day's story is, and I heard this on the radio. Okay, so she has been proved. We thought she was wrong, but now she's right. But really, what does that change? I guess is the other question. So, but I think from her perspective, it's smart.
I guess to be the contrarian, I'll say stupid to provide the other take, which is I think the execution was poor. I think that the idea itself made a lot of sense. I think that the way it was staged, literally staged as sort of a film thing, it was going to be part of a campaign ad, right? And we saw the production that went with it, where she's on the phone, she has this sort of scripted question to the Stanford guy, so Donald Trump likes to call my mother a liar. What do the facts say? And then they've got him saying whatnot. this is someone whose credentials are impeccable, but the way it was packaged and presented, I think just opened it up to looking like it was bogus.
This is not at all a dodge, but I think it was both smart and stupid. The reason I think it was stupid goes to your point about execution. To my mind, it came across as a superficial response to a meaningful question. And the choreography of its rollout I found disappointing because it didn't address what I consider to be the aspects of the test that were smart. And that is to say, to have a candidate confront in the North the kinds of questions that have been confronted in the South for many years, where the percentage of one's black or white blood determined the structure of rights and access to privileges that existed through many parts of our country for generations and generations. People were classified as quadroons and octoroons based upon a perception that a certain percentage of their blood lineage was derived from a person of African descent as opposed to a person of European descent. And for many people in America, skin color and racial identity are key elements of their personas and their personal identities. And I think that there are a great many Americans, increasing numbers of Americans, for whom identity on the basis of a construction, that is the construction of the term race, as it relates to color and other factors, brings up what is really a very serious question about rights and privileges within a democracy. And I think that if she had brought this up in a way that didn't just descend to the question of whether she was 1/64th or 1,000 Native American, she never alleged that she was part of any tribal group. She simply said that she had been told as a child that she had Native American blood, as many of us do. And I think that she missed the opportunity to use her own personal experience and her own DNA to talk about questions of racial identity and how they shape the opportunities that are available or not made available to many Americans today. I can't see how, for example, she missed the opportunity to talk about this in the context of the civil rights suit that's going on with Harvard at this moment around Harvard admissions, and a range of other things that would have made it a serious discourse rather than something that her opponents could turn into a sideshow.
Yeah, and I would add to that politically, I think it was stupid because when we were talking in class beforehand, several of the students were talking about these analyses that are out there that are looking at how do you beat Donald Trump. And I think one of the political challenges that Democrats face is how do you stop Trump from essentially controlling the conversation that Democrats are going to have. And as we see, this was supposed to be her big rollout, her big statement. Trump is very clever and comes right back by saying, I'll do the test, and it's all about him. And so in a way, whatever message she had, whether it's good or bad, he's trampling all over it to the point that, I think politically she wasn't prepared for that. Two more. Trump's doubling down and endorsement of Kavanaugh in a political sense, looking at the midterms, looking at 2020, was Trump's embrace of Kavanaugh, his endorsement after Dr. Ford's testimony and his comments afterwards politically smart or stupid?
Well, I think it was smarter now, looking back on it, had it not gone through, and Kavanaugh, he would have been, had he been facing having to nominate someone else, I think it would have been a huge loss for him. But I think, given the way that things have played out, I think it was smart, and certainly when you have a base that is pretty much supportive of anything that you do, and clearly overjoyed at a win, then it's a good thing politically.
Yeah, I would also say politically that it was smart because I think you have to remember that there was a not insignificant chunk of the GOP electorate that was willing to hold its nose and get behind Trump on the premise that he would be able to install multiple conservative Supreme Court justices. That was a big factor in the 2016 election. So for him to have not delivered on that promise, I think really would have alienated those voters. And I think you could also make the argument that even had Kavanaugh failed, that it would still have been a politically smart move in the sense that it could have galvanized Republicans to turn out in bigger numbers than they would otherwise have this November, and perhaps could have helped form the blue wave. So I think it was politically smart.
Politically, I think it was stupid. And the reason I say that is that Kavanaugh had the votes from the outset. And all that we've said about, swing votes and all that, I don't think was ever real. I think that Kavanaugh was destined to end up on the court. The reason I think it was politically stupid is that I don't think that Trump's continuing support of a conservative court will necessarily mobilize any more of his voting support. But I do think that the terrible show of the hearings will in fact mobilize a number of people who will be more prepared to vote against candidates who stood with a trend that was essentially sexist and demeaned women. And I think that if there's a fringe group, it's not a fringe group, but a perhaps undecided group that is more likely to be mobilized, I think they're more mobilized now against what happened than in favor of it.
But do you think, this is something that Cal kind of alluded to in our class, which is that, there have been all these things written about why are working class whites voting for Trump when he has nothing in common with them, right? If anything, he stiffs his contractors and he exploits people, and he didn't grow up in a log cabin, he grew up in wealth, and so forth, as we know. And yet Trump seems to have an unerring ability to figure out those kind of vulnerable points of the American psyche, and to take issues like immigration and turn them into these kind of emotional crusades. And I'm wondering if you feel that with the Kavanaugh hearing, separate from Kavanaugh, this sense of kind of male concern, right? This notion that our sons, my brother, whatever, could be treated unfairly, is something that men never felt comfortable talking about, the way whites haven't felt comfortable talking about race and so forth, but that somehow Trump has activated something which, again, will become one of those constellation of emotional issues that we may be living with for a long time, even separate from the Supreme Court issue. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, I think that it sort of relates to the Supreme Court question because, in some ways, the court can be the decider of major cultural issues. It has been in some recent cases, right? Notably, it was the Supreme Court that, said that same-sex marriage is protected by the Constitution for example. And you mentioned the Harvard admissions case, which is a big one. There's a decent chance that ends up before the Supreme Court as well, which will effectively put affirmative action on trial. And so, I think there's a real cultural anxiety that the president is tapping into there with conservative justice and saying, our standing, our white male standing in institutions of power such as Harvard are being threatened, by these progressive movements. And so, that's one of the reasons why we need a conservative justice on the court who will help to, beat that back to make sure that, we are preserving our status. And I think that those things are entwined.
And I do think you put your finger on something that's very important. You may criticize Trump for a whole host of things, but he really has been a marketing genius. I mean, that's why Trump is who he is in business. We really don't know how much he's really worth, but his marketing and his spin says he's worth billions. A lot of what's out there has his name on it, but isn't owned by Trump. But if you talk to people, they'll say he owns everything. So it's this amazing ability to wish something into being by marketing. And that's genius. I mean, who knows what it's rooted in, but he can do it, and a lot of other people can't. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that there's absolutely nothing that he won't say or do. And I think in our society, we all have, whether it's something that's innate in us, it's something you're taught as a kid, there are certain lines you won't cross publicly. There are things you won't say publicly, but you feel them, and all of a sudden he says it, and he can get a certain group of people to say, yeah, I would never have said that a couple of years ago. And now when they say yeah, they find out their neighbor across the street also says yeah. And that's how you can start getting groups of people together. They may not like you, they may not like the process. You hear evangelicals talking about how they're now going to passages in the Bible and pointing to flawed leaders who were used by God as an example of why they can support some of the actions of flawed individuals now, including the president. And that's amazing that he's been able to take someone who who goes to church every Sunday and follows the golden rule and everything else, and all of a sudden they're embracing him. That's amazing that he's been able to do that.
Okay, the final one, this is sort of a Democratic strategy question. There's an ongoing debate going on among Democrats now, which is on the one hand, you have Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high. And there's an increasingly a sense out there from some Democrats saying, when they go low, we kick it in the nuts. We go lower. So taking that second one, this idea that the problem with the Democrats has been that they bring a knife to a gunfight, that Trump, because of his marketing genius, his emotional affinity to groups, his unwillingness to be bound by anything, is actually winning because the Democrats won't play that game. Assuming the Democrats win the House, we don't know about the Senate. Should they out-Trump Trump? Should they go low? Should they, impeachment investigations, take him out, as Joe Biden says, behind the schoolhouse and punch him out? Is that politically smart or stupid? And also in terms of the country, is that going to be smart or stupid?
Well, I think it's stupid to do that, but I think that's exactly what Democrats will do. And I also feel that you can't out-Trump Trump. There's only one Trump, and unless you can find somebody who's like a Trump, you can't take him on. Because if somebody will look at you and say one thing one day, and the next day say, I didn't say that, and you have it on tape, and he'll still say, I didn't say that, how do you fight against that? So you have to have someone who is willing to do the same and have that same kind of profile. I can't think of anybody right now who could out-Trump Trump. So I think Democrats playing the same game will only continue to further divide the country. And so I would hope that that would be a wonderful opportunity for Democrats, if in fact they do win back the House, to rise above it and say this is a new day, and we are going to try to wear noise-canceling headphones to silence some of the noise that we've been accustomed to over the last couple of years, and we're going to look to the future and not the past.
I agree. I think it would be politically stupid for precisely the same reason. I just think that Trump is a unique political figure, and I think it would be difficult to beat him at his own game. That said, though, I do think that Democrats, could perform some type of a hybrid model, where their nominee in 2020, let's say, takes a more dignified approach than Trump does, but then is complemented by an army of surrogates who do the dirty work. And my best guess is actually that's probably what we'll see.
Again?
And I agree with that. I think we have an obligation to go high because in a democracy, trust as among people who don't always agree with each other is an essential component of holding the society together. You don't have to worry about that kind of trust so much when you're ruled by demagogues. You go along, you get along. But in a democracy, people who disagree with each other at some level have to trust each other. And at some point, the process of rebuilding trust as among people who disagree with each other has to begin. And if it doesn't begin in 2020, if we wait until 2024, we will have gone so far down a negative path that it's going to be really difficult to recover.
Okay, so we now enter the part of our program where we give Zach his aerobic workout.
Okay, so with the midterms coming up, do you think that it's smart for Democrats that are running in deeply red states that are facing tight elections? Do you think it's smart for them to kind of water down their progressive views and kind of be more moderate, or do you think that would cause more divisiveness within the Democratic Party?
I think that would be smart. I think the poster child for that strategy is Joe Manchin in West Virginia, right? A Democrat in a red state, right in part of Trump country. You've seen him probably be the most conciliatory Democrat in Washington for the last year and a half. He's the one Democrat who voted in favor of Kavanaugh, and I think that for these Democrats who don't have ambitions of some other higher office, if you're thinking about winning your race, I think that they sort of block out the noise. They might aggravate, party leaders by not being as tough on the president, but I think they have to think about what is going to play to their specific electorate.
And I would just add that it's unfortunate that that's the way the system is, so that politicians are making these calculations. And I understand it. I mean, that's how you win. If you don't get the votes, you don't win, you don't get the voice. But at the same time, what you have playing out all the time is they believe one thing in their hearts, but something else comes out of their mouth because they realize that's the only way they can win. And I wish there was a better system. That's kind of how it works.
Let me just a follow-up to that, because Ohio has been a state we've spent so much time. I mean, do you think, part of what's interesting about Ohio is there are a lot of voters there, Pennsylvania, Michigan, elsewhere, white working class voters who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. So do you think whether it's diluting progressive views or saying what's in their head, not their heart, can they win back those Trump voters, or does that ship sail? Will people buy?
I guess it depends on what their current condition is, right? So if the issue for them is about, economic security and they feel like they have gotten that under President Trump, they look at the stock market as an indicator of how which by the way, that's like a flawed, there is really no correlation, I think, between, the stock market going up and down and the overall economy. But that's a visual thing that you can see when it goes up and down, and if it's going up more than down, you feel good about it. If you have a job and if you can put your kids through college, or they just started college and you have a way to start paying for it, then you're coming to this from a different place. And so for those who are feeling confident in not only the current state of the economy, but in the future, then I think it's going to be hard to win them back.
I think the antidote to polarization is compromise. And unless a candidate is prepared to show that they will compromise on some issues, we keep moving down the pathway towards greater polarization.
I go back a long way with Donald Trump. I knew him 35 years ago in New York. When I was trying to sell a lot of the very richest people in New York. And I mentioned to one guy one time, I said, if I can only get Donald Trump, and he looked at me and said, Bob, he said, Donald Trump, I loan money to Donald Trump. My son-in-law loans money to Donald Trump. He's all mirrors. Now, when I hear you say that, he's a genius, a marketing genius, I just wonder how much of what we hear of Donald Trump just happens to be his latest thought that pops in his mind at 3 a.m. And it's not thought out, and that's why it's so hard to deal with.
Well, but isn't that part of the genius? That, if I can have thoughts pop into my head and I end up winning with those thoughts, I'd love to have, the lottery numbers pop into my head and then go and buy the ticket, So that's apparently what's happening with him. So whether it's a genius that's planned or he wakes up and something rattles together, magnets pull something in one direction and he ends up saying the right thing or doing the right thing, it's a skill and it's working for him.
Yeah, he hasn't demonstrated much of a propensity for being a policy wonk, but he does close the deals. We may agree or disagree with him, but the fact of the matter is he's won the Supreme Court he promised to deliver. And he's cut back on environmental regulations. And he's changed many of the rules concerning for-profit colleges. He is delivering and closing the deal on many of the things he promised.
And
so he's persuasive in that regard.
And North Korea as well. I'll just point out, I remember when we thought we were on the brink of war that weekend, where it seemed like, I was looking up in the sky and expecting something to come raining down on us. And he is right in that I'm not looking up in the sky waiting for something to rain down on us. Now, you could argue there wasn't going to be something coming down, but I certainly felt that there was, or to a certain extent. There was that weekend when it was pretty crazy, right? And so he can, in that interview on 60 Minutes, he made the case that before I came along, things were pretty crazy. I took him on, I started being tough, and now look where we are. He counts it as a win. He could have gotten lucky, or it could be one person being scared of the unknown of Trump and saying,
Yeah, and I would also argue, I read something recently which I thought was fascinating, which was that Trump spends a lot of time thinking about nicknames for his opponents. And you can laugh at that, but it shows kind of a genius, right? One of the big issues in presidential scholarship is, what do presidents spend their time on? So Jimmy Carter was criticized because he spent a lot of his time organizing the tennis schedules for the White House. Or Bill Clinton was criticized because he spent a lot of time in these endless policy discussions. Or as you say, Obama was criticized for isolating himself. Ronald Reagan, who everyone made fun of, had 3 things he thought about. And, they ended up being defining moments, not just for his presidency, but for the country. I think Trump knows what he does well. He thinks very much about the power of this labeling. And I think, Cal alluded to this, he is not surrounded by idiots. To become the president of Fox News, which in a matter of a few years became the most watched news channel in the country, to have that person advising you about communication strategy is a smart thing. You may not like what the politics are, but you can't argue that he's got very effective people around him. And so I think there is this kind of, is Trump crazy or is he crazy like a fox? And even watching Leslie Stahl, I think there is also, you can call it a normalization, but in the same way, you told that powerful anecdote about the 2 women who kind of got used to the idea of voting for a black man to be president. I found myself watching Leslie Stahl thinking, he sounds better than I thought he sounded 2 years ago, because we've gotten used to Trump style. We've gotten used to the way he defines things. And so in a way, that's a victory on his part of messaging. And so I think that he has kind of bent the universe a little bit, so that the way people judge him may not be the way people looked at it back in 2016.
Do you think it would help the Democrats if they ran on restoring the filibuster for judicial appointments?
I don't think that's an exciting enough issue to turn people out. I mean, and of course, I mean, the wisdom of that, always hinges on whether you're the party in power, right? I mean, if you're in power, then, you'll love the fact that 51-49 is enough. But yeah, I just don't think that that's, I mean, with the marketing genius of Trump that we talked about is based on emotional appeals. And I just don't think that, filibuster is really going to bring out.
What do you think of Melania suing the Daily Mirror? I don't recall Michelle Obama ever suing.
I don't think it's on.
What do you think of, can you hear now?
Yes.
What do you think of Melania suing the Daily Mirror? I don't recall Michelle Obama ever suing. Did she ever sue any media?
I don't recall that either, no. You were talking about the story about her alleged modeling side hustle.
I don't know what they did. I know
Yeah.
she sued.
I'm familiar with it.
Right? You fill people in. There's a photo.
Yeah, well, so there was the origin for that story, I'm thinking it was the same one, was in a European magazine that reported with really very little corroborating evidence that while Melania Trump was modeling in New York in the early part of her career, that she was also an escort on the side, and there were other news outlets that picked up that report, some with varying degrees of skepticism, and she sued multiple outlets for passing that story along, and ultimately reached a settlement, I believe, with one of the tabloids. The thing that struck me as, sort of unfortunate about it was that, the Daily Mail in particular, that she went after had been one of the outlets that treated the claim with a great degree of skepticism, had mentioned what the original report was, but then had done follow-up work of calling people who knew her during that period, saying, does this story check out, and added in its report that there is no hard evidence we can find to support this claim. And so I thought it was unfortunate that they settled the suit, because I think had it gone to trial, they would have won. I think it would have been hard to make a strong First Amendment case that you're not allowed to, I mean, if you're going to debunk a rumor, by definition, you need to state what the rumor is and then knock it down. And I think to say that it is libelous to state a rumor and then knock it down, I think would be an unfortunate precedent. So that was how I viewed that.
How does the celebrity culture we live in affect people?
Speak up, please.
How does the celebrity culture that we live in society affect Washington?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, how does the celebrity culture that we live in affect Washington, how things are covered, how the media does its job?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that's changed. It's always been one of the issues that comes up with the relationship, this interesting dance that occurs inside the Beltway between those who cover lawmakers and how the lawmakers, the kinds of sources, these relationships. It's always a little troubling for some people on the outside, but I don't know that it's any different now than it's been in the past. I remember, this is not sort of specific to what this discussion has been about, but Vice President Biden used to invite some White House correspondents over to his home, and you could bring your family members, your kids, and all that, and then they would set up this big, water slides. And in fact, if you searched around online, you'd find probably the only picture of a young man shooting a water gun at the vice president, who happens to be my son, chasing him around. And then you see two Secret Service agents just watching. So yeah, he actually shot the vice president with water. And so people, that picture got out there, and people were like, oh, what's this relationship that you have? It seems like there's this cozy relationship with the vice president, and how can you cover someone if you are this close to them? And it's what happens all the time. It's how you get access to some of these folks. There is this time spent at dinners and various functions inside the Beltway. But I think there's an understanding, certainly on my part, there's an understanding that if something goes down, whatever coziness you might have had, whatever slip and slide that you were invited to take your kids to, isn't going to stand in the way of the story. And I remember having a conversation like this with Vice President Biden when we were. In fact, I was eating an ice cream sandwich that I had just taken out of one of those frozen carts on the property, and we started having this conversation. And he was telling me how, you like your kids, this, and I go, that if something went down, I would cover it the same way. And we go, oh, I understand how that goes, and I would. And is everyone that way? I can't speak for everyone, but it's the way the game is played. If you don't know these folks, if you aren't socializing with them, then you don't get into the position where you can learn information that can inform your thinking or help you discover new stories. There's a limit to it, obviously, in terms of everything. There's moderation. So if you're yucking it up and on a yacht somewhere smoking cigars with lawmakers and lobbyists, obviously that's not acceptable. But there is a way that this dance is carried out. I don't know that it's changed much in fact, the probably has moderated somewhat from back in the day.
And I think on the moderating point, by the way, I would keep an eye this coming spring on the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And whether it's different, my guess is that it will be. Recall that the most recent edition featured that sort of polarizing comedy routine by Michelle Wolf, and the White House Correspondents Association found itself sort of apologizing for what it thought was perhaps some overlying humor. Right? It's a matter of taste, obviously. And some of that is, I think we've already in recent years seen the White House Correspondents' Dinner change a little bit. You've seen, a few outlets pulled back from attending because of that sort of coziness factor, thinking about those optics. Do we want as many celebrities at this gala? I mean, the event traditionally was sort of a night to recognize the best in Washington journalism from the past year, and they sort of strayed from that for a while and became this very glitzy affair. I think we'll see a different event this coming year, so that's maybe one way that it's changed.
Taking that question with a slightly different spin, public radio, CNN, Caucus Center, this is like the sensible middle that we all like to think Americans like. I'm wondering, as our first celebrity president, all presidents become celebrities, but he was a celebrity before he became president. Did The Apprentice and his celebrityhood prepare Donald Trump to be a successful candidate in a way that surprised everybody?
I don't know that the show prepared him to be president. I do think that the show helped him to be president, and I mean, you've heard that there's been, I don't know lots, but some articles have been written about the role that Jeff Zucker, who was the president of CNN and was a former head over at NBC, my former boss, who was the one who discovered Donald Trump, if you will, and brought him onto The Apprentice and turned him into this rock star beyond just big time casino developer guy. And they once had this cozy relationship, and now they hate each other. At least that's the way it plays out publicly. I think that it didn't hurt him, but I don't think that it prepared him. It sort of put him, it made him a household name for those who may not have been paying attention to him. And so it kind of, once he got out there and started speaking, a language that they could understand, that's ultimately what swayed them. And then just to jump back to something that you said much earlier about, people changing their minds. I do think that people certainly change their minds, but I also think that there was this, people weren't willing to admit publicly that they were supporting Donald Trump. I mean, that was kind of, before they started shouting supports and going to rallies and saying, yeah, we're Trumpies or whatever it is that they're called, nobody wanted to talk about it, so the secret that they would even go in and vote and then come out and say they didn't vote for him. And so I think that was a factor as well, that there was somewhat of this shame that you dared to vote for somebody like that, but they were doing it anyway, and then they would find out that their neighbor did it, and you would talk about it, and little by little that got louder because a lot of people had done the same thing.
I want to ask a little bit of a higher level question, and I think we forget that Donald Trump won through the Electoral College and not the popular vote. So I would again say we had a scenario where Hillary got more, millions more votes than he did. He won. Getting to 2020 and through the midterms, as people's positions harden, and even more people who may feel that they can now admit supporting Trump and go to vote for him, and other people are more enraged and go to vote for somebody else. If we get to 2020 and we end up with another electoral college president, what kind of country are we going to be in? Because I think that there's going to be real questions about our democratic process. Your thoughts?
I tend to not put too much stock in the sort of rallying cry that Democrats have when we won the popular vote, because that wasn't how the game was played. I mean, the candidates play under the rules as they are, and so had it been a popular vote contest, the strategies would have been entirely different. They would have campaigned differently. Voters who were in solidly red or solidly blue states who didn't bother to turn out because they knew their votes didn't matter, perhaps would have turned out. In other words, I don't know, had it been a popular vote election, that Hillary Clinton would have won the popular vote. We just can't know that. In other words, I don't think you can extrapolate from the fact that she won the popular vote in an electoral college election means that she definitely would have won the popular vote had that been the governing rule. So, what does it mean for democracy if it happens again? It's happened before. It doesn't happen often, but it happens from time to time. I think the last one was Gore, right? Won the popular vote narrowly. So I kind of think that's something that we've weathered in the past, and it would be, if it becomes a pattern year after year after year, then maybe that's a different story. But one or two, I don't think would be a huge game changer for none of you guys.
In this class last semester, we focused on the importance of the rule of law in terms of maintaining the coherence and integrity of a democracy. We've already seen fundamental, long-standing changes take place in the makeup of the Supreme Court, and we can project for probably the next generation right now into the future that the court will have a certain view of the rule of law, which may well not be the same view that we had 5 years ago, for example. So that then raises the question of what the other tools are that are available to an electorate and a populace, whether people vote or not, to sustain the integrity of a system that has been buffeted in the past around votes and the like, and what it is we as voters have to do to help sustain the validity of the rule of law. The Electoral College is part of that rule. And those candidates who may have won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote, to their credit, respected the outcome. So now the question is, how do we assure that there is sufficient stability as we move forward with the rule of law, but gerrymandering and other things have changed some things. We have a census count coming up. There are issues around that. This is a moment when we need to look at other tools that are available within a democracy to maintain its stability. And you raise a good question about that, but the response, I think, ultimately is that we need to look at those other embedded elements of democracy that help to protect the rule of law.
Although I think what's interesting is that the biggest challenge to the Electoral College might have come from Donald Trump if he lost. If you remember, at the end of the election, he was saying, you know, I'm not sure if I'm going to endorse the results. And it's since come out that Obama was quietly going to kind of, you know, grandees in both parties prepared for Trump saying the election was illegitimate. So I wonder if we could see a situation where if Donald Trump runs again and he loses the Electoral College, but wins the popular vote, we might have kind of an upheaval. And you could see, you know, people backing him saying, this is undemocratic, I won the election. I mean, it's interesting, again, bringing a knife to a gunfight. It may well be that Trump is the one who seemed prepared to throw out norms and not play by rules that he feels.
Can I just say as follow-up that I think Tom Friedman's piece about our being Civil War 2.0 is not invalid. And I think your point causes me to consider that even more seriously. And it's a very troubling, and as someone who went through Nixon and the Vietnam War and a lot of other things as a young person, it's a very troubling place for us to have arrived at.
Oh, wait, Doc.
Thank you. The two journalists have spoken about the changes and challenges in covering this administration from previous administrations, and I wonder if you observed any changes in how the public accepts the media or chooses the media. I know for myself, I read more newspapers, more different newspapers than I ever did before. From the New York Times and Christian Science Monitor to Herald. I even read the National Enquirer sometimes, just to lighten things up. And I also listen to CNN and MSNBC and Fox. Do you feel that, and this is all good, I think that being exposed to as much different information, different news is good. Have you observed this, and does this concern you, or is this a good thing?
You're the exception.
Yeah.
So, I mean, everything we know based on research by Pew and Gallup is that people tend to choose their news sources that will not challenge their worldviews, but will affirm what they already believe or feel about the world. And it's, of course, easier than ever to do that. I mean, you know, there's obviously just a bunch of...
There's some improvement. My mother used to watch the guy she thought was cuter, you know, the pastor that I'm looking.
Yeah, that's one way to think of it. Yeah. But as far as how the news is accepted or rejected by the public, yeah, I think that there's been a change. I mean, you see the trust in the press continuing to tick down. Gallup's annual survey on that subject, I think it's down below 30% in the last month. So it's very low. And the thing that really troubles me about it is, and Donald Trump has been very good at marketing this notion, is that fair coverage should be balanced coverage. In fact, right, that's the whole Fox News model. It was for 20 plus years, fair and balanced. And the reality is, those are two different ideals, and we shouldn't confuse the two. In other words, there may be two different arguments over a certain issue, and one is objectively more valid than the other. Climate change is a good one, right? I mean, you can look at the overwhelming percentage of climate scientists who will tell you that humans are accelerating the pace of climate change. We just heard the president in that 60 Minutes interview on Sunday say he's not convinced of that. He believes the climate is changing, but he's not so sure that humans are contributing to it. The overwhelming scientific consensus is that he's wrong about that. And it's legitimate for the press to point that out. But what he's been able to do very effectively is to make the point that kind of fact-checking is biased. It is biased for reporters to referee these kinds of debates. Really what we ought to do if we were being fair and balanced, what we would do is say, well, he says this, you decide. And that's what we ought to be doing. And the reality is, that's not what we should be doing. There are certain issues where that's okay. It's a matter of opinion. Should we have higher taxes or lower taxes? Okay, there are valid arguments on both sides. We'll present them and let you decide. That's a different state. But when we're talking about matters of fact, where there is an objective reality, it's not our job to create a false balance between two arguments that are not equally valid. He's been very, very good at making the argument that if we do referee, if we do call balls and strikes, if we do fact check, that is biased.
Well, I would say that, and you are unique in fact, you spend a lot of time, I guess, consuming news, because I don't even check out that many publications. But one thing that I'm heartened by is the fact that there are a lot of upstart news sites that are focusing on just this issue. They're aggregating different points of view and allowing someone who otherwise may just be inside their political bubble and not see what's going on the left, right, middle. It's bringing people to one place where they might be exposed to another point of view. And you could argue that only certain people go to those sites, but I think if you can pick off one or two at a time, and all of a sudden there are more sites out there that are inviting someone in with something that they completely agree to, and then all of a sudden over here on the right, something else pops in that might cause them to see a different point of view. I think that's a good thing. And you're seeing that either from, sites or different kinds of elements that can be plugged into an existing site where, you might be reading the New York Times, but all of a sudden you get a reference that shows you what a different voice might be saying. Those are the types of technology. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need, technology to help force us, to look around at a world that's much bigger than what we wake up to every day, or what we see every day on our Facebook wall.
Could you name some
Is
of
there a
those?
student?
Yeah, one of them, I always like to give a plug for Bridge News. Is one of them. It's a startup. They were recently brought into the incubation group Mass Challenge, and it's really an interesting site. Is that it's a color coded thing, so you can swipe your iPad to the left or right, and it goes from green, red, and to the middle. I think is green if you're independent. So they offer perspective. It's called Bridge News.
Will the media have a giant influence on whether Trump gets reelected or even runs? Will it be able to balance their hooray, we have less taxes with the Trump, with things like the deficit going up? Or will things like Kavanaugh's, thought that Ford was right and he got away with it, and if they see another instance where voting in North Carolina doesn't do so well because they're getting rid of weekend voting in the name of having even hours, will the media be able to tease all that stuff out so people can get a picture of what's really happening in the world, or are we just going to listen to more yelling and screaming from the White House?
Well, I think it'll be a combination. Part of what covering the campaigns are tricky things to cover because politicians rarely change the message. Whatever they start with, there's some tweaks here or there, but it's the same thing that they say every day. And so when you're out, I remember one of the biggest fears I had when I was the first time that I went out to cover a campaign. And I thought, how do you know what to say differently? You know, you wake up and how do you find the story when they're saying the same thing every time? You're always looking for those little things. And it's always something like, oh, they said it. I thought that they were a little more angry the way that they said that. I wonder if that was meant to be that way. And so then you fire off an email to one of their people, or you corner them and say, you know, was that intentional? And well, yeah, that was intentional. We really, you know, we're kind of putting the pressure on that issue. And so then you come out, you know, today for the first time, the candidate is turning up the heat on this issue, right? It's the way, there's a formula that the way to how these campaigns are covered. It's much harder on a day in, day out basis to get really into the weeds on some of these issues. Now, I think that you need to cover those kinds of ups and downs, and unfortunately the way that people cover sports, that's kind of the way that campaigns are covered. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. But I think that that's all you do, then it's a disservice to the voter. So I think you still have to cover the hits, runs, and errors of the day, but there should be this other texture to, you know, others who are going out and telling some of these stories, focusing on, okay, so today it's going to be Immigration Day, and focus on what's going on with immigration or some other issue. So I think that's how it should be covered. But I will point out as well, I mean, it may seem that we are pretty close to the elections, and we are in a sense, but there's still a lot of time for something else to pop up that will take our attention away from whatever, you know, issues that you were just talking about and that voters may care about and that can be exploited by the politicians. One of them in particular that's, you know, that I've certainly been paying attention to, and a lot of people have been paying attention to, is, you know, what happened with this journalist in Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of implications as to, you know, not only just politically, but what will this mean for business connections between U.S. you know, big companies and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has always been this stabilized force in the region, and all kinds of things that can come out of it. For all we know, and you know, in 4 days, that could be the biggest issue, and that could be exploited by a candidate to say, you know, how would you want to support someone who supports the president who is, you know, is doing absolutely nothing for a journalist who is doing his job and loses his life. You know, that could become the story. We just don't know. And we've seen that before, where we think the story that's going to be the deciding factor for voters 2 days before the election, something else pops up, and that's the reason they voted to change their mind.
And one thing I would add to that is I think, look, we're all in the media, and I'd like to think we're the most powerful people in the country, but the fact is we're not. And in the end, I don't think anybody, I mean, the Post, the Times, I mean, everyone is doing an extraordinary job covering Trump, right? There's no one in this country who can credibly say, oh, I don't know what he stands for, I don't know what he's being investigated for. I think one of the things, I remember, many of you are old enough to remember this, when Dukakis ran for president and lost, I was in the Boston Globe newsroom. And I remember the managing editor walking through the newsroom, coming up to me, saying, Kaufman, we've got to do a series on the crisis in American democracy. And I said, our guy lost. You know, it's like, it's not a crisis in democracy. It's like the other side won. And, you know, in retrospect, you know, to Cal's point that we've been through these moments before, I think there are challenges to institutions, but in the end, it's sort of all about what voters want and voters decide. I think the challenge the media faces is how do you cut through the noise? I'm interested kind of from Cal's point of view because he's been in the middle of this new media environment. You know, the New York Times did this extraordinary, a year's worth of work investigating Trump's finances, and it landed in the middle of the Kavanaugh hearings and had no impact as far as anyone can tell. And a lot of journalists are saying, could you have held it back? Should you have waited? On the other hand, you don't want to hold the news, but I think that's one of the challenges the media faces, which is both in a technological environment where things are moving so fast, and a president who has an unerring ability to say, look over here, you know, don't look over here, look over here. Again, you are doing this kind of 24/7. How does the media, even if it just wants to get its stories out there, get the eyeballs?
Well, but keep in mind, one of the challenges there, though, is that the press has been accused frequently and recently of deliberately trying to time stories for maximum impact to the detriment of this president. And so I don't think we want to get in the business of playing into that accusation by actually making it true, right? So if the Times story, which was a huge project, was ready for publication during the Kavanaugh hearing, that's when they published it. And I think from a principled standpoint, I would applaud that decision because of the accusation the other way, right? And we saw it, for example, play out in my newsroom last year in the Alabama Senate race, where you had this accusation. Why did these sexual misconduct accusations against Roy Moore come out now, right? Just before this election. And keep in mind, they came out after the primary, so he had already won the Republican nomination, and the charge was as if we were playing for the Democrats' team, as if we had known this all along. We were just holding it, hoping that he would win the Republican nomination, and then we could tank his candidacy after the fact, right? I mean, it was quite a conspiracy theory, and it wasn't true, but I don't think we should get into the business of validating it by holding stories and saying, well, if we run it now, it won't, make it. I mean, you can make it on daily decisions, right? I mean, if you have a school, newsrooms have decisions about, do we put it online, at 5 o'clock, and try to make, pick up on the evening news, or do we wait till later? I mean, those are basic kind of decisions. But I think as far as, I don't think that we should be thinking politically, strategically about how to inflict damage on
But
someone.
how do you cut through the noise?
Which noise? Sorry.
Well, I guess, I think there's this feeling somehow that, whether it's Ted's point, that the big issues don't get covered enough. Next week we talk about climate change. It's not like people don't know what climate change is doing, and yet somehow we can't get people to think about it. Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, call us in 20 years when the seas are rising and we'll say, we told you so? Or is there a way in which journalists have to think differently about the platforms they use, the way they write stories, if we think our work is valuable, but trust is declining, readership is declining, is there anything we can do, or do we just kind of keep doing what we've been doing?
Right, great question. I know the exact answer, so I've solved all of our problems. I think that maybe the best thing to do there is to sort of suggest in the question, think about how do we package and tell stories in ways that are going to be most interesting for our audience. I mean, we can't force anyone to be interested in the subject that they just don't care about. But I do think that we can. For example, right? I mean, there was a sort of landmark climate change report last week, right? From it was the UN Council. I'm blanking on the full name, but it's pretty dry reading, right? I mean, so I think when there's something like that, you have to think about how do you deliver the story in a conversational, accessible, relatable way. And I think that maybe it's just from the seat that I was sitting in at the public radio station. I thought that some of our on-air hosts, for example, did a good job of doing that in conversational ways. And we know that our listeners are increasingly skewing younger because they're listening in podcast form and that kind of thing. I mean, that's just one tiny solution. But look, there's always going to be, the outgoing, names writer at the Globe, Mark Shanahan, wrote a very sort of amusing story yesterday about sort of reflecting on his 15 years as the gossip columnist at the Globe, and I thought provided a real reality check about how, if I have some insignificant tidbit about, Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen, people are going to read it. That's just the reality stuff. I think there's a difference there.
Yeah, and just as a footnote to the climate change subject, Mayor Walsh just this morning rolled out at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast, a group of business guys, basically, a very comprehensive approach to dealing with sea level rise and climate change here in Boston. And from what I can tell, his folks understand that when you simply do that kind of speech and provide access to a website, it's like maybe a 36 or 48 hour story. But there's a lot of work that went into it involving public sector, private sector, GE and Gillette, planning along the 4-Point Channel and East Boston and the airport and all of that sort of stuff. And so the way they've rolled it out is to make sure that neighborhood outlets and media get the details that impact on particular neighborhoods, so that the folks in East Boston will see that their issues around expanding a beach are the same issues that exist in Dorchester around expanding some of the marsh front along the Neponset River. And unless you do it in that way, then when you get to the big story, it disappears, or you find ways of engaging people specifically where they live on that subject in a way where they then carry forward the dialogue, and you're not dependent on big media as such to try to drive the discussion forward, because some of these issues require billions of dollars of investment, a lot of which is going to come from the public, taxes, what have you, over many years, and you need ongoing support to make that change. If it's only a one-day story, then the thing won't happen.
And just to pick up on that one, use that exact example with the climate plan the mayor rolled out. Today, General Electric quickly endorsed the plan, so then it becomes a business story, and it was the lead item in the Boston Globe's evening business newsletter tonight. And so that's maybe just one small example of what I was talking about a moment ago, is package things in a different way to get to the audience that might. So in other words, there's an audience there that might not typically read a climate story. They think, oh, that's an environmental story. But then, oh, well, if you turn it into a business story, and I'm a business reader, or I'm stock, whatever it is, well, I care about that now. Because now it affects me in a different way.
And the only thing I would add to that, and I completely agree with both of you, is that we have to be more creative in thinking about how these stories can be pushed out beyond just either an article or a report where someone's standing there with a microphone and giving sound bites on either side. The way that young people, my son is 16 years old, and he's always showing me these really fascinating videos that some kid re-edited something and it's been sent around a billion times. And it's like, wow, how did that happen? Everyone's talking about it, right? We have to figure that out. And some are getting it right, but I don't think all of us fully understand how we can break away from the formula, which is you have to still deliver that, but also look for opportunities to maybe it's setting up a camera somewhere that's watching, an iceberg melting or something like that, or maybe it's showing some place, time lapse or something else. I don't know what it is, but I think we have to think way outside the box in order to get the attention of people out there who aren't, inclined to read these stories or sit down and watch these stories, and may not have the attention span to do so. And so can we give them little 10-second blips of something that's ongoing that they can get hooked on, and they will feel compelled to share with a wider audience?
I bet a bunch of you in the spring saw that video montage of all the local news anchors reading that creepy message about fake news. Did you all see this, right? So up until that point, how many of you have been very closely following the proposed merger of Sinclair and Tribune Media, and the FCC rules and the caps on station ownership and whatnot? A handful of it. It was pretty nerdy stuff. The reason it all of a sudden became a big national story was because of that video, right? It was sort of a visceral reaction that people had. And who put that video together? Deadspin, for heaven's sake, right? A news outlet that shamelessly pays for content. They're probably best known for Brett Favre's weenie pictures, right? Seriously, that's what we're talking about here. But it worked. And so, there's some of that too. You can look down on them, but that was a very effective way of turning it into an important storyline, like who controls the news. In fact, I would encourage you, if you've got time, the New Yorker this week has a very long, very in-depth look at Sinclair Broadcast Group. It's great, but not everybody reads the New Yorker, but a lot of people watch that Hetzman video.
One more question?
So in the wake of the 2018-2016 election, there were a lot of stories of like people visiting small towns and going to bars. They had these, they quickly became a subject of mockery. They were all pretty much exactly the same. And one thing I got when I was reading a lot of them was that they were basically saying, like, look at these people, look at how weird and different they are, but not really doing anything to provide any new information. And I was wondering if the media should sort of be introducing people, when the ranks raise to that, or about like white nationalists and stuff, and they like interview that person and then like talk to someone for a counterpoint. Should they be, or possibly take on the role of like matchmaker and try to confront that person with something that counters their views, instead of like having them, well, essentially quoting them individually, but trying to see, like, actually challenging that person, not saying like, this person has economic anxiety, but I don't know, that should the media just be sort of accepting what people say or forcing them to really go deep on why they feel the way they do? And maybe make new tactics like bringing in counterpoints to sort of introduce things like that.
Well, yeah, I think there are two separate discussions, I think, here. We talked about in the ethics class about, is there value in having CNN, for example, on the morning show in the spring, had a candidate who would have won in the 3rd congressional, he had won the Republican primary in the 3rd congressional seat in Illinois. And is clearly a racist and part of all kinds of groups in the past, and is a Holocaust denier and all these things. This segment went on for about 6 minutes, and it, I think it was more at the end of the whole thing. You kind of step back and said, okay, what just happened? I knew it was going back and forth and two people yelling at each other. What was the value in that? And so there's something to be said for us, offering some perspective. I don't know that when it comes to challenging, sometimes it turns out to be this back and forth, and that becomes the story and not the real information that I think you're looking for. So I think that's one issue. The other issue is, you're right that we refer to network correspondence. We parachute into a place, and when you parachute into a place, you didn't take a road to get there. You didn't stop at a shop, or you didn't talk to anybody. You just landed on top of a roof, and the first person you saw, you started talking to them, right? So I think that what we need to start doing is, first of all, there's a problem that as networks have been cutting here and there over the last few decades. We used to have bureaus all across the country and around the world, and now we operate out of hubs. And so we've lost that touch point with communities where there are a lot of things that maybe we could have said and conversations that we could have had because we had people on the ground. And so I think we need to find a way economically to get back to embedding people back in communities. The same way that we embed people with the military. And the reason you do that is so you can be there and get the nuance of what has changed. The more that we can have people in communities that are following and paying attention to little indicators, the more that we can see that and do that, I think it will make a big difference in terms of the coverage that we get, and we're not just parachuting in and getting that random soundbite.
Cal, any final words?
Well, I think the matchmaker idea is an interesting one. I'm not sure how you execute that on a day-to-day basis. I do think we've seen some models of that, though. I mean, the former network, I haven't seen any done some of these sort of town hall style events. And I think actually some of them are really well produced. I think of the one after the Parkland shooting in particular, I thought was really quite good. I mean, they had people with, they had some politicians, obviously. I think they had Bill Nelson and Marco Rubio showed up as well on the stage, but they took a lot of questions from the audience, and I thought it was really a good example of civil discourse over a really emotional issue. So there are some examples of that. Something we're trying to do at WBUR right now. Yesterday we had a debate. We're doing a series of debates this fall. Not only the candidates running for office, but also the ballot questions. that are on the city ballot this year. So we had one yesterday on question 3, which is the transgender protection question. Tomorrow we have a debate on Radio Boston at 3 o'clock about question 2, which is essentially Citizens United Campaign Finance question. And then we'll have the one on the nurses next week. Nurse staffing level is question 1. So, and these are debates that will function with sort of advocates on both sides. So as opposed to, as you said, just interview them separately, mash it together in one soundbite. Here, let's get them in one studio and let them debate a little while. I think there is a lot of value to that. We can probably do more of it.
Okay, well, that was great. I think we take away a number of things from this. One of them being, as we go home to watch the Red Sox game, that even 260 hitters surprise us. That's good to know. And I think showing our commitment to dealing with serious issues next week is climate change, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks for